Well, I'm very happy in a lot of ways to introduce the last session of the conference. I've had a lot of archaeology for the last few days. I hope you guys have too. This is a good one. This is one of the ones we've all been waiting to see where we're going. We've done the past, we've done the present. Let's talk about the future now. And so the closing session is the graduate student panel, Back to the Future. I'm going to turn it over.
Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Hoover and I'm a graduate student here, and I'm essentially going to give a super brief kind of intro or context to what this session is going to be. And we came up with the name about 5 minutes ago, Back to the Future, but I think it speaks to a lot of the conversations that were really happening across the panels from the past several days and the informal conversations we've been having where the future has been very much so implicit in all of these things. And so I know the graduate students are really excited to have this opportunity to kind of put a punctuation mark or to provide their perspective on how they see these different topics that have been so crucial to the past couple of days. But I'd also just like to say on behalf of the graduate students as well, to everyone that's here and maybe live streaming, thank you for being here, not only in this Sunday afternoon session, but also the conference and being willing to really have a lot of informal conversations with graduate students, whether it's over lunch, like in the hallways, bumping into people. I think it's been a really rich experience for a lot of us, and we'll be taking a lot with us really as we continue in our program here. As a bit of context for the session, we were tasked with essentially talking about the future of archaeology, having the final word as part of this conference. And when we were told that, I think back in March, we all agreed that's a pretty daunting task. How is it that you cap off this conference as graduate students? And so we made a survey and we essentially polled all of our peers. We got about 20 responses, but the core question was, what do you think the disciplinary and research challenges are going to be for the field of archaeology over the next decade? And from that, we kind of synthesized 9 core themes. And then we have 5 questions that our panelists today will be working their way through and discussing that kind of reflect collectively the conversations that we've been having in our classes at 007 and that people kind of expressed in this survey. So that's 5 of, I would say, our best graduate students up here. I think it's really reflective of the kinds of conversations our community has been having for the past couple of years. And just really briefly, I'd also like to really thank Dr. Ashley Lemke for agreeing to be our moderator. She's a relatively recent, alum from 2016 of our program. She's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Texas at Arlington, and I'm sure you all caught her talk yesterday about submerged landscapes. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Ashley, and thanks again for agreeing to do this.
Good? Oh yeah, I can project, I'm a professor. So thank you, Hannah, for the invitation to moderate this panel. Obviously, of course, you all know now that I am a recent graduate of the program. And I just wanted to start by saying first that having Michigan's mark is really important and wonderful, but I also think it's really important for us to stay humble as an institution and as a program. For what we do, but also there are many, many, many people who are doing very good archaeology all over the world that we're collaborating with, and I think it's really important to highlight that as well. So what I'm going to do, you can tell the graduate students are very organized, so I'm not going to play a huge role in moderating them, although we have discussed trapdoors if necessary. I'm going to ask each of them just to introduce themselves briefly, so you can get a sense of the geographic and intellectual diversity of the current graduate students at Michigan, and then we'll jump into the questions. So Kara, if you want to start.
Hello, is this on? Hello? Yes. Hi everybody, my name is Kara Larson. I'm a 3rd year here at Michigan. I study in the Levant in modern day Israel-Palestine, primarily work in the early Bronze Age, and my questions surround understanding the origins of urban living, how specialized economy and pastoralism played the foundations of rising complexity in that area of the world.
Okay, I'm Martin Menz. I am a 7th year in the program, and I work in the American Southeast in Florida and Georgia, focusing on complex hunter-gatherers and monumental sites and hunter-gatherer aggregations and the emergence of some of the first villages in the region.
Everybody can hear me? Oh, yes, there we go. I'm Elspeth Geiger. I'm a terminal student. I study Anishinaabe relationships with plant beings, and in the context of the kind of complicated power relationships between Anishinaabe people and the French in the 18th century fur trade in northern Michigan.
Hello. Okay. Hello, I'm John Cruz. I'm from Peru. I'm a second-year grad student here. I'm very curious and work in different topics, but right now in my life, I'm trying to understand the social, cultural, and ecological implication of the domestication of Andean crops in the high altitudes of Peru.
Hey everybody, I'm Ian Began. I am a fourth-year student now. Time flies. And I'm particularly interested in human and environment interactions, and my dissertation research focuses in central western Patagonia, very specific place in Chile. And more broadly, I'm interested in hunter-gatherer social and technological adaptations to marginal environments.
I'd like to note for the record that I told them they didn't have to say what year they were in. But way to be very open and honest. And also too, I'd like to say that there are a lot of other Michigan graduate students that are in the audience right now. So if any of you ever feel free, if you want to chime in and bring your unique perspectives to the table, please be willing to do that. So with that, our first question is, how does the Michigan model fit into the future of archaeology? And Kara's gonna lead us off.
A daunting question for sure. The Michigan model is why I came to Michigan. As a graduate student, I got my MA before this, and I was having conversations with a mentor of mine, D. Shane Miller, and he looked at me and he said, "There's not many golden tickets in life, but Michigan is one of them." And I believe the reason why it's a golden ticket is because of this Michigan model. So I first posed, what is it? I didn't come into this program my first day. I didn't have this model sit in front of me and said, this is what you're going to do, and here we go. Kind of over my 3 years being here, learning what that Michigan model is and hearing it from other students, back from when I was just an undergrad, seeing Michigan students presenting at SAAs to where I am now. And how I'm going to answer that first is a quote from Systematics by one of our illustrious professors is that Michigan doesn't train specialists. We train leaders. We train the PIs. We train the big thinkers. And I think that has a real place moving forward in this field of archaeology. We're getting so funneled into specialist niche positions. And as I sit through conferences, as I'm hearing all y'all talk about your big picture questions, that's where the future of archaeology needs to go. I didn't mention it in the beginning, but I also do zooarchaeology, I do isotopes, but that's not who I am as a person. I answer these big questions, and that's what Michigan is training us to do. So I think moving this forward, we need to, we're gonna have our small little, data sample sets where we're gonna, focus on maybe for our dissertation, but it's always gonna go back to this big picture and maintaining that throughout our scholarship, whether it is we're a ceramic specialist, a lithic specialist, which I know a lot of you are, a faunal specialist. It's having that continuity for a big picture question. So I think the future of the Michigan model, personally in my eyes, is, all right, we want to answer these big picture questions. We need to get away from black and white, easy yes, no answers. We need to get away from this dichotomy of complex versus, non-elite versus not elite. I think what's really going to be interesting in moving forward, especially in the next 5-10 years, is looking at that messy middle. And I think Michigan is setting us up perfectly to look at that and challenge those very, X equals Y or X leads to Y narratives.
Thanks, Kara. For this question, we're actually going to give all the panelists a chance to respond, so we're just going to go down to Martin next.
So the role of the Michigan model, I guess, in the future of archaeology, to start out, I would also like to maybe provide an anecdote for how I came to Michigan. My advisor for my master's program was when I was talking about where to apply. One of the things he said to me is, you should really apply to Michigan. You probably won't get in. It's a very long shot, but you should just throw your hat in the ring and just see what happens. And then after I had been accepted, I was still kind of debating where to go, the offers that I'd received from other universities. And then I had a beer with my advisor as I was going through that process, and he said, I don't think you understand how big of a deal this is that you got in. Just go. And here I am. So I think there are two main strengths of the Michigan model that I think set us up for the future. The first of which is that we are leaders. Every student here is their own PI, essentially. We are not tethered to the particular research questions or even necessarily the geographic or temporal areas of expertise of our advisors. We're encouraged to go out in the world and do something that is totally our own. And the benefit of that is that all of the things that we've been talking about in terms of advances in method, in theory, and practice, we have the ability to make those happen. We aren't reliant on an advisor, on a professor telling us what we're going to do, that we can make that for ourselves. I think that is probably one of the key strengths that we are PIs, we are leaders. I also think that in talking to some of my other friends at graduate programs, they have a theory course where they learn social theory. We take trads or with sociocultural stuff, and we read some of that same stuff. But when we come to archaeology and we take systematics, this is about archaeological systematics is not a theory course. I've thought of it or described it as like a meta theory course, or kind of how we evaluate knowledge claims in archaeology. And perhaps there are changes now coming in the ways and what perspectives we're entertaining in terms of how we evaluate those knowledge claims than maybe is the classic kind of Michigan approach. But the fact that we're still trained to think that way about evaluating knowledge claims and what premises that we're willing to that we want to kind of bring into that is, I think, a strength of specifically of the way that Michigan archaeologists think, because we don't have, again, advisors telling us what theory we're going to use. We explore that ourselves. So that's, yeah.
Okay, so like Comanche rock art, I'm going to take tally. So that's 2 votes for a bright future for the Michigan model into archaeology. Elspeth, do you want to take it up?
Sure. So because of the way my mind works and the way we were talking about this question, part of it was also thinking about the role of this model in graduate training and how to actually progress and transmit the knowledge of what we do, I guess, in this department. And for that, and this picks up a little bit on what Kara was mentioning, where nobody sat you down and gave you a list of these other things that you need to know about the Michigan way or whatnot, because it was very informal training, and there was a kind of culture set up, I think, that really supported becoming the types of archaeologists that we all want to become or come here to become, because I never felt when I was here like I was supposed to be an accessory to someone else's project. It was always, there's many negative experiences as a graduate student you go through, but that was not one of them here. And you are really told to appreciate and come into your own as an individual and as a scholar, and actually value your thoughts and your opinions, and to really, work on yourself in that way. And the way that was primarily done wasn't we're going to tell you that this is what you got to do and we're going to have a checklist. It was setting kind of a long-term positive examples that are both leading by example, but also setting kind of positive reinforcement over the years of doing that, which that model for teaching is actually called the Pygmalion effect in psychology. So could this be the longest, most complicated running production of My Fair Lady in the history of the world? Maybe. But by George, I think she's got it. It seems to work. And I think that at least informal model of kind of support and allowing us to kind of create, archaeology the way we see it, also fits into a bunch of the new movements that we're trying to do, which incorporates other voices and other opinions so that, you can branch off from there and not stick to the old ways. It's very an expandable model, but primarily the positive aspects of reinforcing that I think should be part of the model that's expanded, maybe not specifically the model itself, but it's still good. Okay.
John?
Now it's working. I didn't make my homework, so let me tell you a story. Because when I tried to apply, I'm from Peru. When I tried to apply to a doctoral degree in the United States, people told me, you need to look for an Andinist to take you as a student. And all my life, I was against to be an Andinist or a lithic specialist, or just to follow what my advisor is going to tell me. Go to that site and reaffirm what you already know. And I said, well, I don't have that intention. So I start to make my contacts in this university with actually a person who shared the topic, but not necessarily the Andean topic or like the same way how I wanted to do my research. So that was a good sign that people are welcoming, even if I'm not in the region and I'm not doing even their topic. So when I arrived here and I noticed we have a full field approach, I get surprised because I need to learn linguistics, ethnology, other courses that some of my peers sometimes find annoying or that doesn't link with their research. But I found personally, wow, it's a really open mind to know what's happening. It's going back to the classics to be an ethnologist. So I have a broad approach how to thinking a problem, not just as an archaeologist with a narrow view to the archaeological materials, but like a culture in general, with language for ontology, with sociocultural to work with people and understand modern problems, biology to understand all those graphics and evolutionary trends. So it was very inspiring for me. And also like to not have the freedom to not follow my advisor path, even like contradict their own research. We are not limited to that, and that's a place for creativity and cooperation that you cannot find maybe in other places. One great example, I was like the 007 that I was the curator for the past year, allowed me to see that we are actually the department who is applying anthropology in their own daily life. We use cooperation, we use the network, we use like the libation, feasting, and all that to create bonds. And that's what makes difference, being a family, not just in a program to get a degree.
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up. You guys were all right. I completely agree with everything you said.
It's like a good hunter-gatherer. Everyone's equal and right.
Everyone's right. Well, it definitely seems like we're thinking a lot of the same ways because we were posed this question, how does the Michigan model fit into the future of archaeology? And I thought, well, I just hope it does because we're products of it. We're products of this Michigan model, and man, I could really use a job. But I think, this question of, is the Michigan model outdated? I think obviously not. Look around this room about all of the people that are impacted by Michigan are continuing to be formed by it, by UMMA. I would say that, this contrast between generalists and specialists, it doesn't have to be such a contrast. Like Kara said, we are able to do these advanced archaeometric procedures, methods to arrive at our research question, the goals of our research questions. And I think the real strength of being a generalist is this ability to collaborate, this ability to go into an area that you're not from, or you might be from, go in and set up a project as a PI and bring a lot of people together towards one end goal, this collaborative effort of archaeology, both within archaeology, with more natural sciences or humanities as well. So I think, the Michigan model, as previously conceived, doesn't really exist. There's no, let's find the origins of agriculture. That's not a thing that happens anymore. It's these questions of how does it happen here and how can we collaborate towards this grander challenge. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that happened, although very slyly, was when they all introduced themselves. They introduced themselves as the problems that they were interested in. So you'll note that nobody said, I'm studying the Middle Archaic component from the Schmidt site in Oklahoma, right? They all introduced themselves with these really broad general themes. And I think that's really illustrative of the Michigan model and kind of how it still is permeating the graduate students themselves. So Huh? And they didn't plan it. They passed the test. That was actually a test I was given in systematics my first week here. So, and we didn't know it was a test then either. One of the last things I'll add just before we move to our next question is Kent and Joyce in the first class I took with them said that we're going to train you so that if you are given a trowel and we parachute you anywhere into the planet, that you'll be able to do archaeology there. And I think the graduate students are really a good highlight of that being true, that no matter where they can go, they can address these broad questions. Okay, so with that, you guys are all doing very good on time. Congratulations. Our second question is, should we be pursuing grand challenges at all? How do we then design research to integrate new ethical and practical imperatives? And in this scenario, which is a good lead on from what we just discussed, Marty, I'm going to have you go first.
Okay. So want to make sure that I'm actually answering the question. So I think that we should be. So I guess the theme of the conference is, the short answer is yes, we should be pursuing all of the like grand challenges, or this idea of like are grand narratives still worthwhile in archaeological thought? So I will start off by noting that a lot of presenters during the conference have been kind of responding to a recent grand narrative challenge in archaeology, which was Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. Even if you disagree with some of the premises of what they're talking about, the way that they employ particular data sets and things like that, the point of that is that it has something it's saying something really important about humanity in general, that we can all either agree with or disagree with. Everybody has something to say about it. That is the role, I think, of grand narratives in archaeological thought and archaeology as a discipline, is not that it's supposed to be a unifying theory of everything. Like archaeology is not a discipline that I think is amenable to like normal science or like a unifying kind of like theoretical paradigm or anything like that. But grand narratives allow us to kind of respond to that through a diversity of different perspectives. I think that's the benefit. I think what these kind of like grand challenges, grand narratives do, they do two things. They synthesize and they simplify. That's really useful for disseminating, this is very important for archaeology, is disseminating ideas to the public to make it known that we are kind of authorities on this, even if there are disagreements in the field on kind of like the specifics and the particulars. And I guess I will just end by saying that going back to the Michigan model, the fact that we are mostly focused on kind of like grand challenges, like big ideas, things that have global import, things that maybe not generalizable but transferable, that we can take something that like I'm learning about early village formation among complex hunter-gatherers, and even if I'm not going to sit there and say like I'm going to look for X, Y, and Z characteristics of this at a totally different world region, there are certain kind of like maybe commonalities that I can think about and transfer to another site to develop those particular histories, those particular local histories, but look for those commonalities. I think that's what that's what we've been doing for a long time. I'll just stop there.
Okay, so Kara, I've got you on the list next, and so I think the grand challenges was really good in terms of Marty responding to that. And then I just want to remind everyone, because this is a long question, how do we then design research to integrate new ethical and practical imperatives? So feel free to answer either one.
Yeah, no, that's where I'm going to kind of try and take my response. So initial response following along the thread of this conference is yes. We should be pursuing grand challenges, but I argue that we need to be pursuing them in a new lens. So we talk about this Michigan model. Again, I really want to not talk about it as this grand big cloud. How do we actually put this into practice? We talk about being PIs, being leaders. What does that look like, for a 7-year doctoral student? Well, that often looks like, hey, let's go excavate. Let's generate some, a data set and, pursue our questions through that. But I think we need to reevaluate how we're doing that. Where are we getting that data? I work, as I mentioned, in the Levant, the modern Israel-Palestine, where previous excavations are, let's excavate the whole site, let's bring in 300 people, excavate this hotel. Holy moly, 50 years later, people are still going through that material. That, is that ethical? Is that the correct way we should be going about these questions? Whose narratives are we trying to portray, both past and present? I mentioned in my earlier response, is this an elite versus non-elite type lens? And I argue that we need to be looking at the sticky middle. These things that don't fall neatly into boxes, nor should they. Culture is a wild web that doesn't fit neatly into one category or another. We need to be pulling apart these false dichotomies, false couplings, and how we're actually going about these grand challenges. So one thing I wanted to pick up, Marty, that you talked about was this community engagement and how we can go about doing that. And this is always a tricky question for me because where I work, there tends to be a lot of political conflict that comes into play, and that's often why I find myself asking, whose past is it? Who am I, incorporating into my, research design? Is this crafting tension? I was in the field this summer with students, and halfway through the field season, we had rockets going off, and okay, well, that's not. I really want to answer my questions on the origins of urban living, but I also need to be practical in how I'm getting this data. How is our data feeding into, nationalistic ideologies? We need to be thinking practically about how we're going about archaeology. And I can't remember who said it, and I apologize, but the outcome of our archaeology should not be to do harm, it should be to do good. So my final closing thought on all of that, yes, we should be pursuing these grand challenges, big questions, but our pursuit of grand challenges, regardless of the archaeological answers that we're garnering, should result in a positive modern outcome.
I know I'm next. I'm seeing in my cheat sheet. Okay, the grand challenge. So I guess one of the things that we know is how we are integrating archaeology to the general issues that's going on in the world. I think it's because I'm going to make kind of analogy, going back to the Schiffer, the archaeological record, the formation process. He forgets something essential. That part of the formation process is also the history of how we do in archaeology and the history of the people who are surrounded to those archaeological sites. So if we put those two levels to the formation process, we can understand what we need to do with the sites, how we need to approach our research, because the answer is going to be contextual. There's not a recipe of how we should address archaeology here in North America that lately I started doing some Clovis site. I'm very excited about that, but it's not the same like doing in Peru, where there's a lot of communities surrounded archaeological sites, or if you're working in a World Heritage site. So it's going to be contextual, and we need to understand that the formation process don't end in the archaeological records, and also in the people and the history and the context of the sites.
You're wrapping up again.
Right, I suppose I'm wrapping up again. But before I really wrap this up, I wanted to point out, I agree with John's statement, and I really like that you're continuing the Michigan tradition of pointing out where Schiffer went wrong. But really, to wrap up this sort of discussion, thinking about grand challenges, obviously, we're all sort of game to tackle these grand challenges, and that ethical and practical imperatives don't have to be opposed to these grand challenges. I think that, in fact, we should be, learning from the sins of our predecessors, all of you in the audience, to create a better archaeology and answer these grand challenges in an ethical way. But not trying to castigate all of you in the audience. Of course, saying that at learning from our mistakes, being candid about them, being open to change, I think is really the important part about the future of archaeology for me, to address these grand challenges. Being like people that came from Michigan or work currently at Michigan, like Joyce Marcus and Kent Flannery, publishing these big books about the creation of inequality, tackling a massive challenge, or Bob Kelly with The Fifth Beginning, tackling the future of our species. I don't think we need to rely on other social scientists to come up with answers to grand challenges. We can do them ourselves. Now, not everyone is Bob Kelly, Joyce Marcus, Kent Flannery, but we can all sort of approach their the way that they think about things because we're here at Michigan.
I'm going to give just a quick opportunity if anybody has a question for any of the panelists before we move on, or if Elspeth or any of the other panelists, you want to respond to each other? You feel like you've tackled this grand challenge? You want to move on to the next one? Okay. Yeah, they're doing very well on time, so I just want to remind you all, if you do want to comment back and forth, we can open it up and make it a little less structured.
There's time. No.
In that case. Okay, but actually, the third question follows up really well on something Ian just said. So how do we both address past scholarship, including academic thought and research practices, and move forward in new directions? So in this case, Ian, it looks like it's punting back to you.
Sure, I'll go again. Right, so thinking about past scholarship, one of the biggest takeaways from my early education here at Michigan was to appreciate past scholarship and to engage with it. It doesn't mean to take every article, every book as sort of like, revered knowledge that is untouchable, right? But rather as resources that can be critically engaged with to create new perspectives on the archaeological record and human social life in general. In fact, this past scholarship must be engaged with. I think ignoring previous work just because the methods might be antiquated or the questions that they're asking aren't exactly what you're interested in, that it's still data that has been gathered and is in a repository of Google Scholar. But just for an example, something that I've become really interested in the past couple of years is this idea of historicizing the archaeological record, and it's something that was introduced to me by Rob Beck through some of his work, historicizing the record and creating sort of an eventful archaeology. I think looking at past data, turning it towards this historicizing of the record is really interesting, and it makes it not only an interesting way of portraying the past as sort of punctuated by events and these catalyzing events that change structures and schemas. I'm probably screwing up a little bit of it, but I think that it's beneficial both to our own understanding of process, but makes archaeological data more interesting to onlookers, people that understand events and understand how history works. It's harder to talk about process and make people understand that. It's far easier to talk about events and talk about, so this happened, which led on to something else. And I think that engaging with previous scholarship and putting it through this new lens of historicizing the record would be really interesting.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. I mean, I feel like that was great. So when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking of this as like, what do we do with like the anthropological or archaeological canon, essentially, like the stuff that we read in trads and in systematics and things like that, and how do we think about them? And I think, Ian, you rightly pointed out that this is not like, divine knowledge received from on high, but these are things to be engaged critically with. I don't think in the room or among archaeologists now, or anthropologists even, that there are very many kind of like, sincere orthodox Durkheimians or Binfordians active anymore, that I think, again, this is something that we've been doing for a while, is engaging critically with the archaeological canon. And we acknowledge that, part of that is to update the things that we put in conversation with that. When I think about kind of the idea of like, so the issue of curriculum, I guess, is very, very relevant to this question. I do see value in kind of like, we're archaeologists, we already have a foot in the past anyway. I think it's important for archaeological thought, anthropological thought to maintain that kind of like foot in the past. but to make sure that we're kind of like updating and being conscious of what material that we're putting into conversation with that past, and how I guess we kind of like assess that past knowledge, which I guess was very kind of like, you know, like I guess I'm not providing I guess any practical like prescriptions for how to do this, I guess, because I think that a lot of us kind of intuitively know what needs to be, like what we need to do, because a lot of us have been doing it anyway. A lot of us, our own intellectual curiosity and recognition that, like, you know, that archaeology and anthropology needs to change and update with the times leads us to try to do that and incorporate it into our own work in a lot of cases. I also think that, you know, there is maybe like maybe this is like a controversial statement, but like providing something that is a foil that people recognize is so wrong from the past to react to is one of the ways that moves things forward. Recognizing how, like, maybe backwards some of the ways that we thought about things 100 or 150 years ago, or even 50 years ago, and challenging that. So I think of past archaeological scholarship, anthropological scholarship as being used as a challenge to the present, that we can react to that and do better.
I promise this answer is actually going to answer the question, although it may seem like it isn't at first. Okay, when I think of this question, it absolutely activates the museum studies part of me, because when we think about doing research, and specifically this is addressing the like engaging in past research aspect of this, we're not always immediately aware, we don't like think and plan out the fact that we're going to engage with knowledge that's stored in a written form, you know, publications and field notes, or that we're immediately going to engage in knowledge that is stored within a very specific knowledge organization system that we have no choice but to engage in order to access that information. And, you know, that system being built off of various, like, you know, Platonic methods and models. So, because of course my bias is, you know, indigenous ontologies, so I'm just letting you know my bias right here. This has been a big issue or you know, discussion within the kind of greater data sovereignty movement, which is thinking about how we can actually access and work with knowledge and not specifically prioritize the Western, you know, storage and kind of ownership and, you know, place of it. And the ways that has been kind of moved forward, trying to basically not assume or take for granted, because it's often invisible to us as just, this is how research is done, that there are other ways of doing it, because we're incorporating other ideas and other, you know, philosophies and sciences from other perspectives. But when we actually get on the ground to do research and engage in past research, and how that knowledge is stored is still barely been touched. But there are movements towards that where, and of course this is coming from a very, like, you know, database archive perspective, movements like creating alternative metadata schemes, online databases like those that like Lisa Young has been working on, or even things like actually engaging in creating a kind of complementary database system like the Brian Deere classification system that's been incredibly influential in tribal libraries in particular, more so in Canada. But so there are those options out there for a plurality in the way that we actually access, you know, kind of put information out there that can engage at least specifically with indigenous ways of knowing and approaching research, because I absolutely think we need to keep moving forward on pulling in new ideas and new ways of thinking, but we also need to expand the literal research process and think about how we can diversify that as well and make that much more accessible to a wider, broader set of people and ontologies.
Kara, it looks like you're gonna summarize and respond. Do you want to add something?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just how we use those past academic thoughts is, well, I really like when Ben previously at morning say that we use theory as a process, not how we organize or hypotheses, not like explanations. It's like a process of accumulation of knowledge. And if we don't know the classics, how we can expect to do something? So I know some peers in other programs, that I'm not going to say the programs, that they're just relying on the current like theories or trend theories sometimes, and they really are not building in any ground. They're just following what is available now by this time. And I guess being here and being able to read a lot of classic, even though we don't want to read all that, but we use all our time to read it. We learning like a long-term process. We're using the social evolution theory to read all how the process of thinking, how people were thinking, how we're improving, what is the new direction. So I guess because we have that privilege to review all those classics, we actually can come with new ideas. And that's the way how we think like theory can be addressed. It's like the accumulation of knowledge.
I think that's a tick for the four-field approach. It's why we as Michigan students need to take cultural anthropology, why we are in linguistics programs, why we are taking biological anthropology classes, is to see how we can think on this much broader scale, think about, how we need to move theory forward. Archaeology particularly is always cast as this kind of, it's going to be a weird analogy, but like this gremlin in the background picking up other theories from other disciplines after it's already done its thing for 5 years, and we're like, ooh, that looks nice and shiny. Let me take that and see if it works in archaeology. And I think it's really true to what Ben said earlier. Theory is a process, not a product. And to what Jeremy said in the opening session about, we really haven't, are we generating new theory? And I think it's a growing, ever adding glob theory that we can pull from others and modify to our questions. That I think what Elspeth, you were saying is really interesting, pulling from like these more indigenous kind of ways to think about these problems and narratives. But something I wanted to highlight too is that we are, and something I haven't gotten a chance to highlight before, is that we're very blessed at Michigan in that we do have this four-field approach, that we have the funding to be able to look through this and to be able to address these big picture questions and go about doing this. And I think what Marty said earlier, we're talking very grandiose, and we're not giving you very practical prescriptions. Maybe we can talk about that over a drink or something later and go into details of how, minutely within our projects we're doing this. And something that struck me was this engaging in archives, this archival research. I mentioned earlier where I work, there's storerooms upon storerooms upon storerooms of potsherds and bones, and I love bones. So I'm often going through these degrading lunch bags full of bones that no one's looked at anymore. That's not new, or we can't really learn anything about it. Excavate, get more data. How are we ethically treating this archaeological record that we've created for ourselves of past archaeologies? And I think we need to not be afraid to engage both within previous scholarship, regardless of if it came from archaeology or another discipline, and we can't be afraid to engage with what was previously done. We may not have loved, the particular excavation methods. Maybe we don't have, the dips and strikes of everything that was there, but with that data is still there, and it should not be ignored. It should still be incorporated in some way. I think that requires creative thinking. So we're not ignoring this also very present problem of generating more and more data for data's sake. I don't know if that addressed any of y'all's questions, but that's that's just where my mind train is leading me.
So I have a response to kind of what we've talked about too. I think we all kind of recognize the need for again maintaining some relationship to past archaeological and anthropological thought. But I also wanted to bring up the idea of especially in the session on violence the idea of kind of like redress or repair. What are you trying to redress or repair if you aren't being conscious of that past that requires that? And so I do think that maybe that's also kind of another reason why we should, I guess, keep a foot in the past in terms of archaeological and anthropological scholarship. Like, you know, there has been so much erasure in it. So not just like overt violence, but erasure in kind of archaeological practice of who's holding the shovel, and being conscious of and again critically assessing that past is how we move forward with those kind of like goals of repair.
Why certain things were excavated over others. I think that holding the shovel, why was this particular site, excavated? Why was this one ignored? Why were we asking those particular questions at that time instead of these, questions that we might now be like, oh, why weren't they investigating that? I think it's interesting to understand that trajectory in history and understand that erasure to then address that while all moving forward. I think it's very poignant.
I think just one of those takeaways that a lot of you commented on was the anthropology part of UMMA, right? It's not called archaeology, it's anthropological archaeology. And I think that's really important, both for addressing the classics, like John said, like, why are we having to take trads? But I took trads with Conrad Kotak, and I don't think any of these folks have had the pleasure, but he used to always put one ethnography a week and just said, what kind of book is this? And we would first tackle, when was this written, who was it written by, kind of who were they as an anthropologist, and why is it still critical for us to know that history of the field and where it came from. And it's not always a nice history, and it's things that we could easily avoid, but it's important that we don't. And to lead into their next question, they've given themselves 12 minutes to respond to what are the possibilities and limitations of archaeology in addressing real world issues? And I want to read the sub-bullet point here. It says, this may include the context of political conflict, fascism, social topics, popular dissemination of archaeological research, engagement and representation with local and or governmental policy agencies. So this is a task. But I think an important one, and I'm glad that they're going to spend some time commenting on this. I do want to remind everyone, no one's going to be mad if we're a little early. So think about this. Obviously, this is a really important question, but I just want to make sure we have time to get to the last one. So Ian, with that, what are the possibilities and limitations for archaeology in addressing real world issues?
Yeah, thank you for the softball question. So I think it's very easy for us to separate archaeology from the real world, right? But it is the real world. This is all really happening, right? Archaeology is indelibly integrated with the modern world, with the colonial world. We as archaeologists can easily separate the past and present conceptually, but there are long-standing things that come from the past and lead into the modern world. I think as we've seen from presentations over this weekend, from countless examples of how modern stakeholders are critically impacted by heritage management and archaeological inquiry, the reality of our discipline is a mess. It's a mixture. It's not easy to say where the past begins and the current world exists. As archaeologists, we're not required to be activists, but I think that we are set up well to do so, to act politically, to have our input on how we want to see the world going forward. I think that these real world issues, whether it be fascism or climate change, I think we're well set up to look at have a diachronic perspective on these topics. But thinking beyond impact on local stakeholders and things like that, I think that archaeologists are particularly well equipped to be positive towards combating climate change. This is the largest existential threat to our existence as individuals, but also how we conceive of our society, about the structures that exist in our society. And I think that archaeologists can look at this in two ways, thinking about heritage management, about how the archaeological record is being destroyed currently by human-caused climate change, thinking about rising sea levels, how is that going to impact our ability to answer questions about the future, answer questions about the past, things like melting of permafrost, destroying sites in the Arctic. These are just easy things to think about. But additionally, our diachronic perspective allows us to look at how humans react to climate change, whether it's rapid or taking a long time. I think it's very easy for people to see what's happening today and say, oh, we can't talk to how human societies act towards climate change because it's a completely different scenario. But we are still human societies that rely on one another, and I think that is something that, looking in throughout prehistory, we see as a coping mechanism, a way of mitigating against risk, is coming together against large threats.
Hey, I'm going to follow Ian's question. It's very true. I was just reading my Binford book for my prelims, so I just come across with the quote, "The archaeological record is in the present." It's in the present, it's not in the past. So if it's in the present, again, we need to think that the formation process hasn't ended just in the archaeological record. It's still linked to many problems that, again, is going to be contextual. And when I say contextual, I'm saying a practical example. I used to work in the Minas culture of Peru, briefly, luckily, and I realized all the need for cultural policies, heritage, because Peru's, you walk and you find sites. You don't need to have GPS, nothing. You just walk and find sites. So the amount of cultural heritage is amazing, but few regulations, few procedures for how to treat, how to research. So I guess one of the real issues is how many of us we really want to engage in those problems. Like, we can have the best will to do my research, to engage with community, or to working up in an ethical way, but if there's no regulations, we're always going to lose. So some of us, maybe me, maybe others, need at some point of the career need to engage in these cultural policies. In some places there already exists this for treatment of the human remains, but in other, like South America, doesn't exist. It's just the lack of people who want to engage on those real problems at the level of administration is required. So we are training here to be thinkers and to do research at high quality. Why don't apply that strategic thinking to politics?
Oh, is my thing on? There we go. Cool. I have so much hope, since the main theme of this panel is about the future. Yeah, just incredible hope for archaeology to actually engage in real-world issues and do something good. Obviously, one of the themes that was talked about primarily yesterday was really worrying about, when our information is out there, how is it being used? So, one of the real-world things for me, I really have a hard time now actually decoupling what I think about with archaeology and the questions from what it can do for people. And mostly because, I do archaeobotany and I think about food, and that's connected to a lot of the really growing food sovereignty movements in Native North America, and the continued collaboration of various scientists, in particular archaeologists, with those modern movements that are led and directed by the indigenous communities. And there are other archaeologists that have also used their data in the long and complicated process that a lot of tribes have had to do to get federal recognition, which is still, there are so many that right now are just caught in this limbo, that there's a huge amount of impact that we could do in a positive way. The things that are huge drawbacks for that, and there are many, is this kind of dual combo issue of kind of legal frameworks we're stuck within, and also public awareness. Because for me, I've in particular the worry that a lot of sites that have incredible data and heritage that is incredibly valuable to the communities themselves are often on public land, but also private land where they are privately controlled, which is upsetting in a lot of ways. But the other side of that is the public awareness issue. And I don't know if any of you have ever gotten on YouTube and just searched archaeology and see what pops up, but it is depressing. So much conspiracy stuff. And we're better about it now, but we're traditionally pretty bad as archaeologists at communicating to the public and actually controlling the narrative about what our research means and in what ways and what it can do. So that has been a big issue in that the dominant narrative surrounding a lot of archaeological data in particular in the US has been controlled elsewhere, not with the archaeologists and especially not with the indigenous communities. And what then ends up happening is you get this like complicated mess of requiring public support and awareness to help back and fix some real world issues, that then when you don't have that and there's misconceptions, or you have things like what was happening up north with some of the, inland consent decree for fishing, was you had environmental groups trying to specifically stop native access to their rightful like fishing grounds because of this perception of somehow native people using nets was gonna like destroy things. Not the industrial fishing that happened a lot. No, that wasn't the problem. It was this other thing. So yeah, we need to, as if we don't have more things that we need to be doing, a growing list of responsibilities. But we really do need to be better about communicating to the public, and then hopefully in some ways because of that, it can start addressing some of the legal issues with that. There we go.
So real quick before I get into the meat of it, Elspeth, I also, the archaeology and seeing what it is, I'm super into TikTok, which might show my age. And you search you search archaeology on TikTok and it's just like aliens, pyramids, all this crazy stuff. And I think we really, I think there's a two-part response to what everybody said up here. And first is how we use our data to talk about global issues and how our data is being used by others. And something I struggle with, and I don't know the exact answer to this, but Elspeth's work I think is really showcasing how to do this, is how to not be a tack-on activist. I'm writing my NSF grant right now, like DDIG, and part of it's like this broader impacts, and it's so easy for us to just think about this great project and be like, oh yeah, and this can totally help with climate change. Boop. And like that's just like a tack-on thing, and I see this happening all the time when you see these these grand presentations. Then at the end, it's like, and this can talk to this really grand big thing, and I'm like, okay, how are we getting from here to there? Like, where are you connecting? I'm sure it does, but I think we need to get better about getting a seat at the big table. I know this has been a big part of archaeological conversations, is we need to be at the table of these discussions. Okay, what are we actually bringing forth to them that they can digest? A climate scientist can digest from our research, on submerged landscapes. What can they garner from changing landscapes out, where I work, and then to give desert, the desertification. How are we making our data accessible for people to use it to talk about big world problems? I'm not telling, gosh, as graduate students, like you said, we have so much on our plate. Also, by the way, solve the climate crisis. But we need to get better as archaeologists, having this deep time element that we have. And we're really quite uniquely positioned. We all know this. We have this deep time to see how these things have impacted human culture over thousands, millennia of years. How do we get that transferable to these real world issues? And I think I also thought you were talking about in actually integrating that within your research design, not just having it be a tack on, gold star, I talked about it type thing. Actually integrating it into your research design is going to be so important. Talking back to the future of archaeology, really going full circle, and how we move this forward. But also how our data is being used. Oh my goodness. I mean, such a huge problem. I mean, I can really pull on the examples from where I work. It's used daily. I was telling someone the other day that someone tried to fight me at a conference because because my data was arguing for complexity earlier than what the biblical narrative was saying. That's a very specific example. But how do we go about challenging how this data is used? And I think a much more unfortunate example is being used for nationalism, fascism. We talked about our trads class. One of my favorite assignments, the non-archaeology assignments, was at the end of my trads class, I had, do anything related, to a topic that then relate, anything in social cultural anthropology, which is huge, relate that to your field. And I decided to talk about nationalism in Israel-Palestine. And it was so enlightening to see how archaeological data was being used for bad. And it kind of got me thinking of, oh my goodness, how am I contributing to this, larger problem? It's not just me alone, but it's like, grains of sand being added that contribute to unfortunate narratives. I wish I did. I wish I had answers. I wish I had a clear answer on how to do this, but I think it's something we need to be cognizant of. How our data is going out there, how we're talking to the public. Don't be scared to talk to the public. I love TikTok. I loved going on TikTok and talking about like archaeology and things and making it digestible. Obviously that's not great, it's not the medium for everybody, but don't be afraid to talk to people. Don't be afraid to talk to local communities. I love talking, to the Bedouin pastoralists that work in my region. That's my main takeaway. Talk to people. Our work, even though it's happening thousands of years in the past or millions of years in the past, it impacts them. It truly does.
Just quickly before moving to the next question, to follow up on what they've said, to follow back to that analogy of the parachuting in analogy, I think it's a good analogy for saying, you can parachute anywhere in with a trowel, and then, you'll have the tools, the theoretical and methodological tools to do it. But I would urge everyone, and it sounds like they're not just parachuting in and parachuting out, that you actually stay in and engage with those communities that you're working with. I recently went to Alaska, to the native village of Kotzebue, and earned a lot of social capital for just staying in Alaska in March for a longer period of time, because most researchers really do, in that case, helicopter and get the data and helicopter out. So just as a final comment on that, I'd like to just encourage everyone to look up the work of Alexandra Jones. She has really you probably all know her, hopefully. She's really carved her own way, but I think it's a good model of someone who she does archaeology in a community. It's a nonprofit, which is really great. Why are we all laughing? Do we all know?
Alex Jones?
Yeah.
The InfoWars?
I said Alexandra Jones to make sure no one would make that mistake. But Alexandra Jones she's a historical archaeologist. She's on the board of Society for Historical Archaeology. But she has a PhD and could do anything, and has kind of set the more traditional academic route aside and formed a nonprofit called Archaeology in the Community. And that speaks to what some of you are saying in terms of communicating to the public. She's on TikTok, she's on all these social media platforms to get a message out there and kind of combat the pseudo-archaeology, aliens, UFOs aspects that we often run into. So we have a little bit of time left, and I'm going to have everybody, you all are going to have just a couple minutes, again, to answer one of these very large questions. What is or are the futures we want to enact to better the culture of archaeology? And some of this I think we just touched on in the last question. So try to keep it as brief as possible, although that's a hard task, so we can just have any questions from the audience at the end. So we have this Ian, Kira, ping pong thing going. You're from
Other sides of the table. Yeah. No, I'm happy to start. Keeping it brief, I think in terms of the future of archaeology, in terms of the culture that we want, I'd like to find middle grounds between everything. We live in a country where there's so many extremes, either political extremes, social extremes, what have you. I think finding a middle ground between how we treat each other, how we're treating ourselves, and how we treat ideas is incredibly important. And I'll talk more about that last part, how we treat ideas. We need to take ideas that the things that we've discussed here and put them into action, but not only looking at ideas from outside as these opponents we have to face, but critically engaging with them, how we're interacting with them, and putting these things into practice are some of the, I recognize the irony sitting on a panel and talking about action. This isn't a very action-oriented thing. This is kind of just speculation, right? But I guess more to the point, we are supposed to be the future of archaeology here, and I have no interest in waiting for a tenure track position that might not exist in order to change the field. I think that as a field, we have to come together towards a better culture, not only in how we engage with each other, but how we engage with ideas that we might not be comfortable with.
You caught me. I don't have any point. I will follow the flow, I guess. Yeah, I think like the next steps or what's coming is again, I like to think in contextual way because not all the problems are similar. But what I agree is that archaeologists, we have a really big privilege to understand or approach the past in a coherent way using scientific method, at least data, to approach that. And we build narratives that can have bigger, if not major, implications of how people, communities, politics use it. So we have a big responsibility in how we are doing archaeology. So we need to maybe double check before even try to do stuff, because we are the only discipline maybe who can like travel in the past and make these arguments and connect with real people. So I guess just being subconscious or conscious what is like the implication of archaeology is a good start. Like we are not just doing like personal research interest. So like I just want to solve my curiosity problem. We are working for people ultimately. We're still doing anthropology. We work for people, and that's who owe our work is for them. So we need to hear them.
Like that last point a lot. That was nice. So speaking of people, I feel like in the department, or at least among the graduate students, I've accidentally created a brand for myself as like the feelings person, where I'm like, let's normalize mental health and let's care for ourselves and actually make sure that we are healthy and there's room to be able to have a life and also be able to succeed in finishing our degree and doing work, you know, because sometimes it does feel like we're always just like one family emergency away from completely falling apart at any given time. But what essentially this kind of connects honestly back to like my first comment is I really want the actual culture of how we train and do archaeology and how we behave in the field to be much more associated with care in the same way that we may have that care with ideas that's being, you know, pushed forward. And, you know, admittedly, when I'm in the field, I'm always like maybe 2 steps away from the kind of like mom trope of button up your jacket, you're making me cold. But obviously that's a very mothering kind of model, not for everyone. But I just want there to be more room for other ways of leading is what I'm getting at. And traditionally, at least in academia, kind of more feminine associated traits like that or forms of leadership have not been valued as much. And I would like, in addition to generally creating a kind of growth mindset for our work, a growth mindset for us as researchers, where, again, kind of going back to my first one, we know based on research that punishment and negative reinforcement does not work on people. So let's use what we know with psychology actually works, which is, yeah, caring for ourselves so that we can actually be better archaeologists. And, you know, what that looks like on the ground is obviously a lot of the work that Michigan has already been doing, where in the past few years, we've had expanded orientations for students as they come in, basically setting expectations and kind of clarifying a lot of the hidden curriculum that's been in place. And yeah, I'd like a lot more of that.
So I first want to kind of like give some attention to and acknowledge kind of a lot of the changes that have been occurring in archaeology over the past several years. A lot more focus placed on, you know, issues of gender in archaeology and sexual harassment. You know, SAA and then several other, you know, like regional archaeological societies have surveyed and tried to create policies to address that. Similarly with kind of like, you know, we talked about UMMAA evolving that kind of like space on our website where we showcase kind of like some of the work that we're trying to do to make archaeology more equitable and disseminate our results and kind of work with communities more. However, there's one other thing that I'd like to draw our attention to in archaeology, and that's the issue of labor. Several of my friends, so I worked in CRM for a long time. Well, a long time to me, but so like 5 years of my time, and it seemed like forever. But several of my, my friends at work and I would basically joke about, like, what would happen to the practice of archaeology if we were forced to follow OSHA? It would ground to a halt. And climate change is currently and going to make archaeological fieldwork less accessible and more dangerous. This past summer, you know the news story that I'm talking about. A young archaeologist died, I think, first day on the job, working in field conditions over a heat index over 110 degrees. I've worked in those conditions before too, and it sucks. And it's easy for us, I think, we're not quite in a tower right now, and it's not quite ivory. We're in, but it's easy. I think it's too easy for us to say that that is not us, because we're not CRM. We're not driven by a profit motive. But everybody, like, we all love fieldwork, but every person in this room that's done archaeology has either themselves or knows somebody that has fallen out in the field due to heat exhaustion or dehydration, or had bug bites and needed to go to the hospital, or poison ivy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the kind of culture that I want to build in archaeology is, I think, going off of what Elspeth said, an archaeology that is a little bit more focused on, care for yourself and care for others in the field, and not just in a way that kind of serves the various identities that we all have, but that serves our physiology.
I love this question, and I'll try to stay to time. My number one takeaway is stop the gatekeeping, especially in the structures of how we are engaging in research, and especially in fieldwork, as Marty just poignantly very said. We need to get rid of this mentality of, well, if I did it, you should do it. If Henry Wright washed thousands and thousands of fire-cracked rocks, so should you. Just because you went through this, think of fraternities and sororities hazing, doesn't mean that the next generation should have to go through that as well. If we're talking about the future of archaeology, we need to make sure that there is a corpus of people to leave that future to. We can't scare them away by, yes, work in 110-degree heat. No, you're not going to get water, and work until, it's lunch break, and then maybe you'll have a sandwich. That's not how we should be crafting future archaeology. Archaeology is fun. It's exciting. It's why we're all here. We fell in love with it in classes, and we wanted to keep doing it. And I think the SAA panel that happened a couple years ago about sexual harassment within women, how deeply troubling, upsetting, heavy it was to hear about women, bright futures in the field that left because of these awful conditions that we're setting up we haven't changed. We're talking about the futures. Move how we're practicing archaeology forward into 2022. We need to lift these people up. They aren't just worker bees. I constantly say that to my undergrads. You're not just a worker bee, I'm sending you out with your shovel and work, give me data, and maybe I'll acknowledge you and give you a pat on the back. No, these are active research participants. So one of my goals, and I'll talk a little bit more about a practical prescription. One of my separate goals, other than figuring out the origins of urban living, is getting more women in Near Eastern archaeology, and not just as side notes, but as sitting at the big research table. Invest in them. I brought them with me to the field this summer. Some of them are sitting in this room. Hi. Get them excited about archaeology. Get them out there. We're at Michigan. This is a very particular example. We're at Michigan. Find them funding. Get them out there. If not at Michigan, get them, connected with organizations that provide funding to get them to the field, or write them in your grants. Treat them as people. On top of making sure they had plenty of water, we were doing a heavy survey in 100-degree weather. I talked about rockets were flying. It was not, sunshine and roses the entire time. And they still want to come back next year because I made sure I invested in them. Every week I had our mental health check-ins where I sat down with them and I talked with them and, hey, how are you doing? Actually a one-on-one, how are you doing? Are you excited? What are you excited about? What are you struggling with? Let's talk it through. And I think that made a huge difference in showing them that they're not just little ants, doing my survey, that they're actually invested in this research project. I want them, not just generating the data, but how we're thinking about it, how we're answering these bigger questions. It's so important to me, and where I'll kind of leave that discussion off is let's make that a part of the Michigan model. It's not just being PIs in the field of what we're researching, but how we practice archaeology. Put that in the model, be leaders, not just in, studies of domestication or, complex societies, but also in how we practice archaeology. So we're not just crafting PIs, we're crafting a holistic and inclusive field.
I was waiting for like a effect at the end.
Done.
Okay, so with that, I want to thank, of course, all of our panelists, and we do have 10 minutes if anyone has a question or comment they would like to make. I was going to call on people. It's like a professor, Amanda Logan, front row.
Thanks, particularly to all you graduate students for your organizational abilities as well as your thoughts in this just a little bit daunting sort of setting. Several thoughts came to mind. I'm going to try and just stick to one or two here that I want to pose more as a question than a comment, but we'll see if I succeed. One thing that has struck me about the discussions in the entire conference, but also today, is we talk a lot about the Michigan model in archaeology and what that is, but one part we tend to maybe not delve into as deeply is the archaeology as anthropology sort of angle. And the reason I raise that is because, we're also colleagues with some of the best sociocultural anthropologists in the country. And I do sort of wonder, as graduate students now, how you see, my perspective is archaeology is always a decade or two behind. And sometimes it's not appropriate, right? We don't want to be the gremlins, as you were saying, sort of hoping for some leftovers from our colleagues. But where this, I think, comes to a particular head is in the issues that were just raised. And that is sort of, where do we go from here? How do we take archaeology to the 21st century? And it strikes me as something that we need to talk about more as a field, and certainly this is not on any of you, our ethics of archaeological practice. We've heard the do no harm sort of mantra a few times, but we haven't talked about how we make sure to do no harm not only to each other, but to the communities we work with. And we have to really, I think, go back to the starting with who's we, who's us, who's them, which communities and which stakeholders are impacted. And luckily we have colleagues who have already done a lot of this work and gone through these growing pains. So I guess this has turned into more of a comment than a question, and I don't want to put any of you on the spot, but I would really just hope that future involves learning from what many of our other colleagues have been talking about for years and rethinking who the we is, what our research questions are, who they're designed for and by. And then I will have hope, and I think you all are getting there, but I think we all have a little ways to go there. Thanks.
Saw other hands earlier. It's gonna be good. This is like a role reversal for me to call on you, so I'm just not gonna do it. Oh, you're first.
Hello, hi. There's a fair amount of comment in this as well, but I will get to a specific question. We started this off talking about the Michigan model and what we think that means, and I think the broadest way of putting that is that it trains us to be generalists, right? It trains us to be not just leaders, right, but it kind of just this ability to wear multiple hats, to be kind of maybe the Achillean hand axes, if not like Swiss Army knives of archaeology, and that's wonderful, right? I mean, and that's very empowering. And that model comes from a time that was also very different, right? Culturally, technologically, for the field, right? And being in this time now where I'm seeing, right, just not only just like increasingly technical and specialized tools that we use, but also just increasingly diverse like social obligations, right? To the academic world, to your to communities, to your team, right? And we have a huge willingness to take all those things on. I sort of wonder. I personally have sort of questions of like, when is that too many hats for one person? When is that too many tools on the knife? And I think one of the great things about being in a place like this is that we are supported in still trying to do that, right? But I guess question one is like, is it just me for you? But also, where do you sort of see the role in like professional relationships? Playing into sort of being those PI Michigan archaeologists going forward?
Hello. Thank you. I'll try and touch, I won't be able to touch on all of it. I'll leave room for others. On this increasing methodological specialization and kind of how we're, how many hats can we realistically wear without, losing, I think of juggling, how much can you actually juggle before it all falls down? I actually recently just had a conversation with one of you fine professors earlier in this conference about me particularly. I do archaeology and I do isotopes, and I was like, how do I not be the isotope girl? How do I talk to bigger things and wear these multiple hats? And I think the metaphor of putting too much on our plate maybe needs to be more so of taking bites of a bigger piece of the cake and slowly eating at it. Like, don't be a flea jumping around to different, hot topic issues, but this is a gross metaphor, but like be a tick on a bigger question. But stay on it and slowly eat away, or a gremlin, I'm so sorry, like slowly eating away at it and show that over the corpse of your scholarship that you have this big question. We're not expected to have the end-all be-all answer at the end of our PhD, but to continue working on it and eating away at it, and don't be afraid of collaboration, because while yes, I do have my specialties, I do use isotopes and fauna to answer questions of complexity, I know I'm not a pottery person. I look at a bunch of sherds after a while and my eyes get glassed over. So I love collaborating with other people and answering those questions. But I think it's kind of be a tick on a question and slowly eating it away. Sorry, that was unfortunate.
Okay, so your question also just kind of reveals a paradox in which we have increasing hats and requirements. We need to be logistical experts and expert photographers and everything else, and leaders, and also need to be kind of controlling and not controlling, creating our own research project and having stakes in that, and not just being, like I said earlier, an accessory. But at the same time, then we also really do need to collaborate and have other people to help us and delegate. And so in some ways, I know that can work really well, and you can find like a middle ground there, but it does feel like you're kind of being pulled in two directions, that you need to find other people to do this, and if you have, but not everybody can be that leader. You do have to like build a team. And I find, I wish there was a little bit more direction on how we do that and still maintain our, like the core of what we're trying to do, but I don't know also if that's like something as a field we can control when there's so many other external forces within universities that are placing increasing expectations on professors and time that, just feels a little bit out of our control. I just remembered my first year talking to a professor that passed by, and I was like, does it get any easier? And she was like, oh God, no. It just gets worse. So I don't have an answer, but I feel you on that.
I guess their answer is they're saying it's not just you. Yeah. To answer your first question. I think we've got time for one more. Got one. Are you curious?
Yeah, so I've taught every member on this panel, and I'd like to first say, how proud I am of you for the kind of level of independent thinking that you've demonstrated. So something we all are doing, I guess, is right. And at risk of giving you PTSD, I'd like to ask you a question. There's been a lot of talk about ethics and community collaboration and doing good. And I was struck by one thing Mike Blakely said in the opening session, and it was something he said very, very softly, but he said it twice. And I wonder if you heard him say it. He said, "We have to tell the truth." And so my question to you is, with all this discussion of ethics, what is our ethical responsibility to the past?
They're having a PTSD moment. I could sense it. It was physical. But Marty, it sounds like you want to.
Oh, I feel like I've been asked this question before. I feel like this is a question from Systematic. So replaying the greatest hits. I don't know if you have any of our answers handy to compare and see if we've grown as archaeologists since then. So I think that so I think, you know, this is definitely a difficult question, because telling the truth, there are, again, we talked about, or I mentioned in my initial answer, is kind of like we have the tools to evaluate truth claims, and there are competing versions of the truth. And can we then, if you're asking about an ethical responsibility, the one thing that I'm thinking about is can there be two truths that we can kind of like give equal credence to whilst and call that responsibility, basically? Like, there's probably a lot of people in this room that disagree with each other about how to answer that question. So I am not going to say that I'm going to give an answer that is maybe satisfactory to everyone. But I do think that that I don't think that it is necessarily incompatible under ideal circumstances to do right by the archaeological, you know, record, to do right by the past, and also to make sure that we are kind of like achieving the ethical goals that we have set out for ourselves. Those two things don't have to be in conflict. When it seems like they are, it might be a problem of how we're approaching the problem.
So we're stewards of the archaeological record. And I think that's ultimately what we're getting at. We're excavating, we're generating this data, and it's how we go about doing that I think we're arguing that needs to have ethical consideration. At the end of the day, you know, you can ask me, you know, at my site, hey, is there Kermit Kurak ware there? No, it's not there. Like, I can't fabricate the truth. I also can't cherry pick the truth. So I think on you know, from the back end data side, I can say what's there, I can say what's not there. As I mentioned earlier, and the poster I presented the other day, it pushed back against some narratives that, you know, particular biblical scholars are not very happy with, you know, and arguing for complexity that was earlier. This is what the data is showing me. This is, you know, this is it. However, that's from the back end. Looking at it from the front end, how we're designing our research structures, what questions we're asking, what data we're trying to generate. I think that can kind of go about this whole, kind of what Marty was saying, these multiple, I don't want to say multiple truths though, but I struggle with that. So I'm still struggling with that aspect of it. But I think in how we're designing our research needs to have those ethical implications. But at the end of the day, I can't cherry pick to, you know, there's, what is that? There's no easy answers. That's what I'll leave that on.
I guess I have an answer, probably. Well, anthropology actually celebrates the diversity. So if we are not looking for truth, because the past is the past, we just approach to the past with different narratives, and that's the different anthropological theories, archaeological theories. So there's no truth, because if we want the truth, maybe we should study philosophy. So we are creating narratives of the past. So we should just acknowledge the different ways how we approach the past but our task as an ethical archaeology is to like be able to say, well, that's not a good way to create narratives because you're causing harm because it's not systematically, don't have data. So I guess we need to respect all the different truths about the past. I don't know who I am to say that I have the truth. Maybe I have evidence, fact, but that's not the truth of the past. So we should celebrate all those diversities of approach to the past, but we need to be careful how we transmit those messages.
I interpret that question as a more of like a call to action. I mean, it is a call to action, but specifically with us thinking about our role within the, again, I'm obsessed with the production of knowledge and research, but you know, you can do the research, you can put it out there and not make a statement about it, and then it's kind of up to whoever looks at it, how they interpret it and how they use it. But I think that, yeah, us perhaps taking a more active role in the interpretation of that and being specific and trying to add nuance is a truth that is much more complicated and probably provides more opportunities for healing and less miscommunication. I don't want to like set things up in a duality of like, there's things that are bad and things that are good, but no, there are things that can do harm, and I feel like the we having to tell the truth, it means that as archaeologists, we do actually probably need to be much more in the forefront of communicating that to people and being very specific about it. Yeah, so that there can't be too much twisting our knowledge into something completely different.
Yeah, and just to sort of build on what's already been said, going back to my point about finding a middle ground, I think we, of course, do have an ethical responsibility to be arbiters of the past, an ethical responsibility to be stewards of the past. And to me, finding a middle ground in terms of different knowledge bases means not fetishizing one over another, of taking these things as they are and being forward with our own biases and being candid in how we're viewing things and how we're presenting them as well.
With that, I would like to ask everybody to join me in a round of applause for the graduate students on the panel.